I think history is important. I think it helps to put ourselves in context and the issues we're dealing with in context. I think it helps to know the past so that you can understand the present and understand our possible futures.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
So Adam, can you kind of, you were a former history teacher, and you still, that's still definitely in your blood. Can you kind of help us contextualize this bill while we wait potentially for the representative to join the line?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Thinking about this bill, and especially after I saw that you had secured the legislator, which I hope, still happens, and it's interesting to talk to the author of a bill like this, especially a bill that we've been so adamantly opposed to. But really, my biggest question to start with is, if we're being honest, is this bill really for everybody? Is this something that is aimed at all people of Alabama, or just some kind of folks? Are we supposed to believe that cops and prosecutors and judges across the state of Alabama are going to enforce this bill equally across all types of people? Now, I'm still a fairly young man, not as young as I look maybe, but I have a hard time believing that. I'm sorry. I have a hard time believing that this is for everybody. And, this is one of those pieces of legislation where you have to ask, is this really going to solve more than it causes problems? Are the solutions that are in this bill actually going to be better than the problems that come out of it? And unfortunately, in Alabama's legislature, that's so often the case, especially with these hot topic bills that go through every session, certainly on an election year session like 2022. So, you mentioned I'm a former history educator. I think history is important. Hot take, I know. But I think history is important. I think it helps to put ourselves in context and the issues we're dealing with in context. I think it helps to know the past so that you can understand the present and understand our possible futures. So with all that said, as Alabama looks to advance this anti-riot bill, quote unquote, I'm sort of thinking about riots in Alabama. What are the riots that have taken place in Alabama? And most of what you could call riots in the history of our state were at the hands of racist lynch mobs, the Klan, other white supremacist forces of all stripes, to include those in law enforcement themselves. And, I'm talking about events like the election massacre in Eufaula back during Reconstruction in 1874. Thinking about the Birmingham riot in 1963, and on and on and on. Throughout Alabama history, we've also seen company thugs and other violence with company thugs and their allies and accomplices in law enforcement seeking to violently crush workers for even trying to build a labor movement here in this state. I'm thinking about Gadsden, Alabama, some of the violence that we saw in Gadsden, Alabama, especially back in the early 30s during that massive organizing wave and the massive strike wave that we saw across textile mills and industries all over the country. It was right here in our backyard as well. And the company thugs, their allies in law enforcement and the authorities, they used violence to try to keep out the unions. They used violence to try to prevent integration in the unions. So I've been thinking about that. And of course, those tactics were then later used on the civil rights activists and organizers in Gadsden throughout the years that followed. Even Huntsville, right here, we're broadcasting from Huntsville. If we want to think about Huntsville's riot police, the riot police in Huntsville was actually debuted against striking rubber workers in 1994, the same riot police that we've discussed in June 2020. So, if we bring it forward, We know that the Black Lives Matter protest that took off in 2020 after the police execution of George Floyd became the largest protest movement in our history. And we're talking incredibly diverse crowds across 50 states, all 50 states, small communities to the biggest cities. And we know that, underneath all the rhetoric and some of the hysteric news coverage, particularly on the right of these demonstrations, they were remarkably peaceful and demonstrably peaceful. You Google it for yourself if you don't believe me. Overwhelmingly peaceful, especially considering the amount of human beings involved and the issues at stake here, literal life and death issues at stake. Now, and common sense tells you if you get enough people together, well, there's bound to be at least one jackass in any crowd big enough, right? I mean, that's just inevitable. But these demonstrations, which obviously this bill and others like it in state after state have been in response largely to this uprising, this interracial uprising against criminal injustice and police violence. So in the cases where there was violence with these protests, which again is the obsessive focus of some folks on the right, in many of those cases it was far-right instigators or the law enforcement themselves who escalated the situation or who instigated the violence. That's reality. Far-right provocateurs. And if you look at what we know based on the history of this country, the history of every major social movement in this country, we know how the governments respond. So we can safely assume that at least some of these folks out here causing problems at these demonstrations are themselves government agents or criminal informants. Now, that's not me being a wild conspiracy person. That's just me paying attention to the history of every social movement in this country. That's why history is important, to provide this context. So, and we also know, and something that Jacob, you've done a great job really keeping in the forefront. We know how the state forces use what they already have before this bill is even enacted, and hopefully will not be enacted, but we see how they're already responding to our brothers and sisters down in Brookwood on the picket line.
Yeah.
We've seen how this county judge can issue injunctions against the striking miners down there to restrict their First Amendment rights, while the authorities turn a blind eye to the violence and tactics and misbehavior of scabs and people aligned with the bosses, and in some cases bosses themselves. And I appreciate your reporting on that. And something we've also discussed is in this bill, it of course takes a mandatory holding time. Well, in the state of Alabama, that is no joke.
Right.
We are talking about Alabama's jails and prisons are notoriously unsafe. They are so unsafe that our federal government, the same government that presides over the highest incarceration rate on planet Earth, even they say Alabama's a bridge too far. Even they're like, wait, hold on. Y'all's system of jails and prisons is pretty messed up. You're going to have to do something or we'll have to take it over ourselves. So that's how damn bad these are. It's not just a routine, visit. When you go in, I mean, I think we can't say it enough that a 24 or 48-hour hold in a jail in Alabama can ruin your life, and it might just end your life. That's not a weapon to be used against people lightly, especially when they are trying to exercise their rights under the Constitution and, frankly, their human rights, just by virtue of being on this planet with all of us, for this ride with all of us. So, again, and you think about Huntsville. We've talked about this as well. In Huntsville, the June 2020 protest that took place here, to the extent that there was any riot, quote unquote, It was at the hands of the police. It was the police who rioted, not the people. The people were peaceful. And I'm sorry, but you're never going to convince me that because some folks in a crowded, chaotic situation didn't immediately run to their cars when given a curfew that they may or may not have heard, that is somehow, a carte blanche excuse to then start tear gassing people. I'm never going to accept that. And it's wild that folks who fly "Don't Tread on Me" flags and praise small government can defend that.
Yep.
So that that experience in Huntsville definitely colors my perception of this bill. And again, that's not just my opinion about what happened in June 2020 in Huntsville. There's very clear, extensive reporting, and there's evidence from the city's own investigation. Their own independent investigation, however toothless it might have been, it very much confirmed what we discussed on this show and what so many other activists in the community have pointed out about what really went down in those events. So now I know Representative Treadway is retired police from Birmingham, and he has brought up Birmingham's experiences with those protests as his rationale for this legislation. But I mean, let's look at it. Even this so-called riot in Birmingham during 2020 protest. Yes, I mean, there were some incidents where it got out of hand, it got ugly. There were a few, knuckleheads, as you can get with any crowd. But there were some folks who got rowdy. There was some property damage. That is true. That's true. But now weigh that against the routine gun violence and violent crime that happens every year in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. That's not connected to any movement. It's just, that's a fact of life. It looks pretty tame when you think of it that way. The fact that, some idiots broke some windows, tried to rob some stuff. Well, okay, there are folks trying to rob stuff every day in this state. It's not necessarily political. And it also looks tame compared to the long, ugly history in Alabama of white supremacist violence and anti-union violence directed against ordinary people, everyday people like us, and the types of folks who are on the receiving end of these bills. So, again, I say all that to try to put it in context, because that's how I'm thinking about it. And having said all that, I can't help but ask, okay, again, is this really for everybody? Because I'd like them just to come right out and say what they really mean. Because I think we can reach our conclusions here, but you're not going to convince me that the cops and prosecutors and judges of this state are going to be using this law against wealthy, powerful folks in the same way they'll use it against working class folks and poor folks. You're not going to convince me it's going to be applied the same way to Black Lives Matter protesters and, socialist protesters and gay and trans protesters, the same way it's going to be used against far-right demonstrators. I mean, in the state of Alabama, there have been multiple people indicted or under investigation for participating in the January 6, 2021 riots in D.C. Now, is that who you're concerned about, Representative? Because I got a feeling it's not. So, and again, our state motto is "We dare defend our rights." Nearly every leader of this state for over 200 years that we have been a state has championed small government. Now, whether they believed it, whether they enacted it, they all said it. Almost every leadership we've ever had for 2 centuries in this state talks about small government. So I don't think it's a lot to ask that we, the people of Alabama, be able to exercise our First Amendment rights to free speech and free assembly without the threat or fear of being locked in a cage by armed agents of the state.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.